Good evening and welcome. I am Digveer Jayas, Vice President Research and International at the University of Manitoba. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the University of Manitoba is on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Welcome to this evening's topic of discussion that explores the reality of eating gluten-free. Tonight's panel is made up of University of Manitoba experts in the areas of food and human nutritional sciences and medicine, and a business owner specializing in gluten-free foods. They provide a unique blend of expertise to inform what I am sure will be an interesting and engaging evening. Your moderator tonight is Dr. Natalie Riediger. She is an assistant professor and social nutritional epidemiologist in the Department of Food and Human Nutritional Sciences in the Faculty of Agricultural and Food Sciences. Dr. Riediger received a Canadian Institutes of Health Research Early Career Investigator Award in 2018 and the Governor General's Gold Medal when completing her PhD in 2015. She is also the 2020 recipient of the Terry G. Faulkner Memorial RH Institute Foundation Emerging Researcher Award in the interdisciplinary category in recognition of her research excellence. In addition, she has successfully competed and received research funding from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the Canadian Celiac Association. Her research is specific to eating gluten-free has been published in Canadian Medical Association Journal, Open, and the British Journal of Nutrition. Dr. Riediger will introduce our panel for tonight. I'm certain you will keep them busy with the many questions. They will be happy to share their knowledge. Thank you, miigwech, merci, and welcome, Dr. Riediger.
Thank you, Dr. Jayas. I'm very happy to be here tonight. I'm going to be providing first a quick overview of how we plan to proceed in this online Café Scientifique format. Each of our panelists will speak briefly on their perspective based on their expertise on tonight's topic, eating gluten-free. I will then open things up for discussion and questions from the audience. So questions can be posed via Slido, which is the link is at the bottom for viewers. So when you go there, you type in the hashtag or the number sign CafeGF, and that will get you to the page to ask questions. There's also a link in the YouTube description of this feed if you're watching. So you don't need to download any software for this application. It's just using your internet browser and the discussion code. So I'll be moderating questions from Slido as well as the interactions with our panelists this evening. And that brings me to tonight's expert panel. They are Dr. Dawn Dirksen, Dr. Manika Malagoda, and Betsy Hebert. Dr. Dawn Dirksen is an associate professor of medicine and section head of the Division of Gastroenterology at U of M's Rady Faculty of Health Sciences. He is also the medical director of the Manitoba Home Nutrition Program and medical advisor for the Winnipeg Regional Health Authority Department of Nutrition. He is the chair of the Professional Advisory Committee of the Canadian Celiac Association. His research interests include celiac disease and ways to optimize quality of life. His teaching to medical students and residents includes updates on celiac disease. Dr. Manika Malagoda, my colleague in the Department of Food and Human Nutritional Sciences in the Faculty of Agricultural and Food Sciences. She joined the department recently in September 2020. Her research program is focused on grain chemistry and processing quality, and as such, her lab does a lot of work on grains such as wheat and oat. She completed her PhD at the North Dakota State University, as well as postdoctoral training at the University of Minnesota, where she studied wheat chemistry, protein chemistry, and grain processing and utilization. And finally, Betsy Hebert. Betsy is the owner of Cocoa Beans Bake Shop Incorporated, located on Corden Avenue in Winnipeg, Manitoba. As the owner and creator, she is passionate about learning, growing, and expanding her knowledge and capacity for making yummy gluten-free food. Staying current with new ingredients and baking trends keeps her engaged and excited about her career. 10 years ago, she began her entrepreneurial career in her basement, selling at farmers markets. Today, Cocoa Beans is located on Corden Avenue with a full bakery and full culinary kitchen with a staff of about 15. During the COVID-19 pandemic, they expanded yet again to include a flour blending facility and now have 4 baking mixes in various grocery stores across Manitoba. At home, Betsy is a wife, a mom, and a nana to 5 amazing grandkids. These other roles bring her an immense amount of joy. Her and her husband enjoy hanging out at the lake and have taken up sailing as a hobby. Well, I'm so excited for tonight's discussion. So we're going to get started. Everybody gets a few minutes to provide their perspective on this topic, eating gluten-free. So we're going to start with Dr. Dirksen. Welcome, Dr. Dirksen.
Can everybody hear me here? I'm just making sure. Everybody can hear me? Yes?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Okay, so thanks again, Natalie. What I wanted to do in the next few minutes is simply maybe talk a bit about why people might go on a gluten-free diet. You know, one of the things that I see quite a bit of here in clinic is celiac disease. And again, just for those that may not be aware, you know, when we talk about celiac disease, these are individuals who have symptoms or laboratory findings that are abnormal or a positive family history. They've undergone testing where they've had usually a blood test that's positive, and then they've undergone a biopsy that they have some intestinal injury from gluten, and that's classic celiac disease. And the mainstay of treatment, in fact, the only treatment that we have currently is a gluten-free diet. So we see that the prevalence of celiac disease generally, globally, is approximately 1%. So about 1 in 100 people will have this. And by the way, we think it's somewhat underdiagnosed in North America, and so we're trying to improve that. The second thing we see is something called non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and that's a bit more confusing. These are individuals who they think they might have celiac because they get similar symptoms. If they avoid gluten, their symptoms go away. If they re-challenge with gluten, they get the symptoms back again. But if you test them with things like blood tests or biopsies, they are completely normal. So that's more of a sensitivity. We call it non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And then the third thing that I will see is people that have what's known as an irritable bowel, and which is a condition that's quite complex, where people have an abnormal movement of their gut, they have an abnormal sensation of their gut, they have an abnormal processing of messages in their brain, and they may have some food sensitivities as well. And there are a group of sugars called FODMAPs, and in fact, wheat is one of those. And so people with an irritable bowel might benefit, and go on a low FODMAP diet may also benefit from a gluten-free diet. So I see people with these 3 conditions, and avoiding gluten impacts all 3 of these. I'll maybe leave it at that, and I'm happy to expand on things or touch other things that if people are interested.
Thanks so much, Dr. Dirksen, for that great overview. Mm-hmm. So Dr. Malagoda, go ahead.
I talk about this issue from a food science perspective. So, like Dr. Riediger just mentioned, I work a lot on grains like wheat and oat. So my research has focused mainly on gluten proteins, both from a functionality perspective and utilization in food products, as well as from a celiac disease perspective. So In the case of celiac disease, there are several proteins that are involved in triggering the immune response to this disease. So specifically, the gliadin proteins have the antigenic regions that give rise to the immune reaction. And what my research in the past has shown is that the variation amongst wheat cultivars in terms of their protein composition, specifically their gliadin protein composition, is very diverse and quite varied. And along with that, in my past work, I also quantitatively analyzed some of the proteins and protein fractions that cause celiac disease. And what we found is that there's so much variability there as well. Specifically, when analyzing cultivars that have been released in the last 100 years, so from the early 1900s to like 2015, what we found is that the protein composition has changed quite randomly. And most importantly, for this discussion, the protein fractions that cause celiac disease also changed, but in a more random fashion. And what that tells us is that these epitopes existed from a long time, and that they've been in wheat since a very long time. We also looked at ancient grains, so grains like emmer and kamut, and what we saw there was quite similar. So again, we found the protein fractions or the proteins that cause the immune reaction, which led us to believe again that they've been here for a long time. So that's what the research has shown so far. And in comparison to what has been found elsewhere, there's been contradictory evidence, but more recent studies have shown that these protein fractions or celiac epitopes have been present in historical cultivars and are currently also present in modern cultivars. So they've been there for a long time. And you mentioned earlier, going on a gluten-free diet is the only medical solution for these types of celiac disease and other gluten-related sensitivities. So as a food scientist, I completely understand the difficulties of formulating food that are texturally similar to food containing gluten, and also from sensory perspective, having those same attributes is quite challenging. Mm-hmm. So definitely this would be an interesting discussion, I'm sure, and I'm very happy to talk about it as we move along.
Thanks so much, Dr. Malagoda. All right, Betsy.
Okay. You
Thanks.
can hear me? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so probably 14, 15 years ago, my first daughter was diagnosed with celiac. Hadn't a clue what it was. And we started doing some research and found out that there's 7 of us in our family that have celiac disease. And at the time, I felt that there wasn't a really good option for gluten-free foods. I didn't like food before because it made me sick. And now to eat gluten-free food where the texture, the crumb, the mouth feel was like sand, it was hardly appetizing. And so being a doer, I decided that this can't be the way I have to eat for the rest of my life. There's got to be better alternatives, and started doing my own research and studying of different ancient grains and what was available to the North American market and what is specifically available in Winnipeg. And what I found was I was pretty much on my own, other than I did have one competitor at the time, and I looked at him as, sort of the guru of gluten-free food because he was one of the pioneers. And I even walked into his shop and said, "Hey, where can I find the gluten-free flour?" And he said, "Oh, you're new." And I was like, is it that obvious? And what I discovered was there's a blend of flours, and they don't all create the same outcome. And so the information that I gathered and the ingredients that were available to me, we started creating our own blends and our own mixes. And then we went from there and I started with cakes because I loved cake and I didn't want to give that up. And then slowly was asked at farmers markets, do you do this? Do you do that? And my business just continued to grow out of demand. And I am far from an expert. However, I have a lot of experience and sort of I've gained some knowledge over the years, being part of panels and being part of I guess just doing research. And so now what we've learned is that a gluten-free environment cannot contain any wheat, rye, or barley. So we're different as a shop because we do not bring wheat, rye, or barley, which may be contaminated. The barley and rye may be contaminated with wheat, and also oats. But there are some companies in Canada that are working really hard at bringing, gluten-free oats to the masses, and we do use their product, and it's grown right here in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and so we're like the hub of the oat products. But so we do not allow any, we're very stringent label readers. I will phone the manufacturers. I will find out how it's processed. And we, because I'm celiac myself and I'm quite sensitive. So if I don't tolerate it, I don't want any of my customers to be glutened or poisoned because they're trusting me with their bellies, really. And I want to make sure their bellies stay happy and that they can enjoy items or food products that taste as familiar as their gluten counterparts. So that's me in a nutshell. Tons of questions, would be happy to answer what I can. You've got great panelists here, so I'm sure one of us can help you.
And the questions are already coming in. So I'll start with the first one. They're both anonymous so far. I'm on a gluten-free diet, and I would like to know what happens if I eat gluten once in a month. How harmful is it to my body if I just eat gluten sometimes? I don't know, Don, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, no, sure, I can handle that. So I think that it's been an area that's of great interest, and actually it's a great question, which is difficult to answer despite the fact that it seems pretty straightforward. There have been some studies done, first of all, that tell us that it is really just a small amount of gluten that will cause intestinal damage. And when I talk small, I would say something over 50 milligrams, and that's in the range of crumbs. So it's a tiny amount. So we know it doesn't take a lot. Now, some people get symptoms with that, some don't. Even if you're not getting symptoms, that doesn't mean that there's no damage going on inside. So that can happen regardless. If you're getting symptoms, it's always easier to stay away from it because you have that automatic negative feedback. Mm-hmm. And then the next part of the question is, what about if we do this infrequently, once a month or whatever? I think that when you look at intestinal damage and complications relate to that, probably regular exposure, chronic exposure, is worse than an occasional intermittent exposure. The question always is, well, what's too much? Is it once a month, once a year, once a week? We don't have that answer. So what I tend to tell people is, you want to try and do the best you can. As Betsy already said, it's tough out there because there's a lot of foods that might have a bit of gluten in it. There's things that may have gluten in it. If you do get gluten on occasion, I don't think that's going to be a problem. If this happens once, twice, 3 times a year, I don't think it's going to be a problem in terms of long-term complications and outcome. You may get symptoms. It becomes a slippery slope because some people say, well, this one didn't really bother me. We'll just do a bit more. And then you kind of accelerate that. And at what point does that now cause chronic problems? At some point it will. So my advice always is, avoid gluten if you can. If it happens, and it's happened infrequently, it probably isn't something that is going to cause any long-term adverse outcome. But there's no question that the more adherent you can be, number one, the better you'll feel likely, and number two, the less likely complications are. So I wish I could be a bit more definitive, but it only takes a small amount, and I am more concerned about people that have this regular exposure than I am about the occasional gluten ingestion that may happen.
Mhm.
Thanks. Okay, I think more questions are coming for you, Don. What types of vitamin to take constantly in order to prevent a vitamin deficiency resulting from a gluten-free diet?
Okay. Yeah. So I think, if you look at, people have looked at the nutrient content of gluten-free diets, and, what are the things that might be lacking. Fiber is one of them, which isn't a vitamin, but I think people should be aware of fiber. And, this is where gluten-free oats might be helpful, for some folks, because, there would be a fiber source there. The other vitamins that might be less than in a normal diet would be the B vitamins in particular. So I usually recommend that people do take a multivitamin. Over time, fortification, which is another issue, Betsy, you might even want to speak to that. Fortifying foods with things like folic acid, etc., which happens in a lot of regular diets, is something that is becoming more common with gluten-free products as well. So that is less of a risk factor. But I would say the B vitamins and the fiber are two of the things that people have to be cognizant about. Unrelated to this, some people will avoid dairy products because it bothers them. And so now we've got a calcium issue potentially. And then because we live where we live, vitamin D is always something that we're concerned about, but that's not really specific to a gluten-free diet. I think that would be more specific to a lot of us.
Right. So I can jump in, and fiber, like Dr. Dirksen mentioned, is something that I know myself I struggled with when I was newly diagnosed. And so I have created most of specifically my breads. I didn't want to be eating empty calories. So because a lot of the gluten-free bread is full of starches, rice flour, and not very nutrient dense. And so we went the opposite way, and we went, what do we have around in our environment? And flax is a huge commodity for the prairies. And so we found a gluten-free source of flax, and it goes in just about every one of our breads, our buns. Even we've discovered psyllium. Psyllium, we are now using it in a powder form. Very good for fiber, as well as some ingredients we would add, like chia. And then you have some of the ancient grains that are a little bit higher in fiber. And on the culinary side, we do a lot of beans. We're learning more about pulses and legumes that we grow on the prairies. And so we are really cognizant of, for people who maybe, we have so many different variety of people coming in with different sensitivities, and there is a huge push now for plant-based diets. And so how do you make a plant-based burger that is nutrient dense with still the taste and the feel and the mouth feel in your mouth, and that satisfies your tummy? So all of those high fiber sources are things that you'll regularly see in our baking and in our kitchen.
Dr. Malagoda, do you have anything to add about fiber and grains? Hold on, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Well, grains are definitely a good source of fiber, but being on a gluten-free diet means that you wouldn't be able to consume wheat, barley, and rye. But like Betsy said, there are other sources that you could get grains from, fiber from. So definitely exploring those options is ideal. And I think it's great that the fiber content has been increased in the mixes or the products that are being developed in the bakery. I think that's a good way forward and would sort of address some of the concerns that people have, people on a gluten-free diet are facing.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Okay, I have a question here. I think probably Betsy and Dr. Dirksen will both have some insight here. I have celiac disease. What about my daughters? Is it possible that they also have this disease?
Go ahead, Don.
Sure, I
So,
can start, and Betsy can maybe tell us about her family a bit. But
yeah.
So, as I mentioned, the prevalence of celiac disease is about 1%. And if you and a family history is a risk factor for sure. Mm-hmm. So if one family member has the chance of a first degree relative getting it is about 10%. So it's about, instead of a 1 in 100 chance, about a 1 in 10 chance. And as I mentioned, there's two things that are important. Number one, celiac disease can develop at any age. So you might develop symptoms when you're a toddler. You might develop symptoms in your teens. You might develop symptoms in your 70s and 80s. Why that happens is another question, but we certainly know that it does. So any age group is at risk. And the other thing that makes it a bit tricky is that if you are tested with blood tests and you test negative, let's say at age 40 when you develop some symptoms, it doesn't mean you're negative for life. And so you could turn positive 5 years later, 10 years later. So it is possible that you test negative, but that's not when you had celiac. You will develop it later at some point in time. So again, what I tell people is about 1 in 10. I see people in clinic who have been diagnosed, their parents get tested, their siblings get tested, and everybody's negative. There's one person, and that seems to be it. I've got other families where you've got 3 children, they've all got it, or 4 out of 5 have it. So within that, that general 1 in 10, in some families it's a much more prevalent condition, whereas in other families it really is quite unusual. And so we do recommend, for sure, if you have a family history and even some mild symptoms or something that is related to celiac, I would absolutely test for that. There's some debate about whether it's family history and you're asymptomatic, should you be tested? A lot of people will recommend at some point you probably should be, but that's something that is a bit more controversial. So Betsy, I'll throw it over to you for your comments.
We seem to have won the celiac lottery in our family, and it all started, like I said, about 15 years ago with my daughter, and then her doctor suggested other families get tested, other family members. And so I had been having symptoms since I was probably in junior high. And I kept thinking I was allergic to wheat, or I was allergic to yeast, or I was allergic to something in baking, because every time I ate, I felt sick and I didn't know why. And so I went through so many allergy tests and it all showed negative. And it wasn't until about 15 years ago that when my daughter was diagnosed, that I got tested and I was a high positive. And now, probably, I don't want to age myself here, but 40 years or so, I didn't know that I was celiac, and yet I was having all the symptoms. And so it's nice that the diagnosing is getting, I guess there's more awareness of being tested for celiac. And so all 3 of my children have celiac disease. And then I have 3 siblings with celiac disease. And so that gives us 7. And where did it come from? Who knows? My dad passed away early, and my mom, who I would put her in the category of symptomatic, but always showing up negative. And it's very interesting to watch, because now my kids who have children are concerned about their kids, because it's so prevalent in our family. And so far I've got a 10 and a 13-year-old granddaughter and grandson, and so far they're testing negative, which we're very happy about. But yeah, like we're always aware that they could definitely be positive. And honestly, when you have a family that's full of celiacs, it's way easier to eat. But anyway.
Okay, I have a couple questions about testing. So one is, how is celiac diagnosed and can you die from it? And the other one is about, is it true that if you're trying a gluten-free diet and then get tested for celiac, that the results may be skewed? So Dr. Dirksen, I think this one might be for you about testing.
Yep, I can certainly tackle that. So I'll answer the second question first, because that's pretty straightforward. The answer is yes, it is true that what ends up happening, and that's in fact the beauty of celiac disease. It's really one of the only diseases we've got where by diet you can control it completely, and that means that symptoms get better, blood tests normalize, and your intestinal biopsy normalizes. So if you're very good at able to adhere to gluten-free diet, everything will normalize. So if you empirically go on a gluten-free diet and you feel great, and you had celiac disease, things are going to heal up. So by the time you get tested, it could all be negative. And at that point, we don't really know whether you got it or not. Because as I mentioned at the beginning, there are people out there that have this sensitivity called non-celiac gluten sensitivity that can get lots of symptoms. They get lots of bloating, lots of diarrhea, really be very, very affected by it, but not have celiac disease. So I would emphasize being on gluten. The best thing to do if you think you have celiac is get tested first before you go on a gluten-free diet. I know the temptation would be, let's start a gluten-free diet because I really want to see if this works. I say get tested first because it does make a difference whether you have celiac or one of the other one of the other gluten-related disorders. And that testing starts with a blood test. And here in Manitoba, we run a test called the TTG, or tissue transglutaminase antibody. And that's a very sensitive test. So it has over 95% sensitivity. So if you're negative, it's very unlikely that at that point in time, you have celiac disease. Very unlikely. Not impossible, but really rare. If it's positive, these antibodies aren't 100% specific. So if it's positive, it means you probably have celiac disease, but we're recommending for adults that you get a biopsy to confirm it. And that involves a scope, an endoscopy, where we can look down into the small intestine and take biopsies. And if you have a positive biopsy and a positive antibody, then you have celiac. And once you have celiac, you've got it. It doesn't go away. And that means a gluten-free diet is what we're recommending for the rest of your life. I think that the testing is very important. So I can't recommend enough to get tested before going empirically gluten-free. If you test negative, and now at this point you say, "Gee, I'd like to see if I feel better on gluten," that would be okay. Then I would say that's fine. You don't have celiac, but maybe you will feel better. And then avoiding gluten is a very reasonable strategy. So I hope that answers it.
I think that was a great description. Okay, we're going to move now to talking a little bit more about grains. So Dr. Malagoda, the question is ancient grain more natural for humans to eat than more modern grains or cereals? I don't know, that's a tough question.
It certainly is a tough question, Natalie. So I'm not sure what's meant by natural here, but what we have seen so far in research in North America and in Europe is that from celiac disease perspective, is that the specific proteins or protein fractions that cause the disease have been there in the historical cultivars and in the modern cultivars. So they've been present, but they've been varying throughout the years. So in terms of being more natural, again, I'm not sure what natural means here, but what I can say is that we've seen these epitopes in the historical cultivars and in the parental species of wheat. So they have been there, and they are currently present in the modern cultivars as well. So we do see changes in protein composition, but then again, from a celiac disease perspective, from the perspective of the specific epitopes, what I can say is that they've been present in wheat for a very long time.
Is there differences in cultivars across like Europe or within North America in terms of the different protein composition that would make different grains perhaps, for people with irritable bowel who might have some gluten in the diet, maybe not completely excluding it, or, is there certain wheat, different, like, can you explain a little bit more of maybe about the different kinds of wheat?
Yeah, sure. So protein composition in wheat is impacted by the cultivar itself, so the variety and where it's grown. So when you compare wheat grown in North America versus wheat grown in Europe, there are definitely differences because there are different varieties, different growing environments. However, similarity lies in the presence of epitopes. So the same epitopes are found in the European cultivars, and the same epitopes are found in cultivars in North America. In terms of differences between wheat cultivars, so from a genetics perspective, bread wheat, as we know, is hexaploid, and the parental species are diploid and then tetraploid. So there are differences in terms of their genetics when it goes to the parental species versus the hexaploid species, the bread wheat. And there are certainly differences between the different varieties that we grow in North America, in Europe. And like I said, even if you grow the same variety in two different locations, it would cause changes in the protein composition as well as other protein-related characteristics. So I guess wheat is very complicated, and protein chemistry is even more complicated. But I guess what I want to say is that there are different factors that contribute to the gluten protein composition, as well as allergenicity. And I don't think there's a lot more to do in this area, including finding ways if we can actually deactivate the regions that cause celiac disease. So there's a lot going on, and there's a lot more to do. Yeah, that's all I have to say.
Thanks. That was good. That maybe partially answers one of the next questions, but I'll try to go in order because this one was up now for a while. Have you heard of a connection with liver disease and celiac disease? I don't know, Dr. Dirksen, you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, so there celiac disease is considered disease, and it is associated, there's a higher chance of getting other autoimmune diseases in addition to celiac. One of those areas is in the liver. So there's a liver disease called autoimmune hepatitis. There's another one called primary biliary cholangitis, which are immune diseases. Those are a little more common if you have celiac. They're not super common, but more common than you'd expect. The other thing that celiac is associated with is if you are newly diagnosed, there are times where the liver enzymes that we measure in the blood can be elevated. And we're not quite sure what's doing that. When you go on a gluten-free diet, those liver enzymes tend to become normal. And so in some way, the celiac is resulting in some irritation of the liver, but it doesn't tend to lead to chronic liver disease per se, unless you have one of these autoimmune liver conditions. So the bottom line is that it's not one of the major risks, but sometimes having abnormal liver enzymes can be a manifestation of celiac disease. And sometimes if you have if you have, you be at more risk of developing an autoimmune disease based on having celiac.
Thanks. Okay, we got a question that I feel like we should backtrack a little. What is gluten? Who wants to tackle gluten?
I can answer
I
that.
think I was going to say I'll volunteer Monica for that one.
Sure.
You're the protein chemist.
Yeah.
So gluten is a collection of proteins that's found in wheat. So specifically the glutenin proteins and the gliadin proteins. These two proteins themselves are composed of different smaller subgroups. So there's alpha gliadin, gamma gliadin, and omega gliadin. With regard to the glutenins, there's two types: the high molecular weight glutenin and the low molecular weight glutenin. So if you want to visualize what gluten is, if you make some dough, just flour and water, and if you run it under water, you'd end up with a rubbery mass, and that's gluten. So it's basically the protein that gives wheat the functionality that we observe in everyday products. So gluten is what gives the viscoelastic properties in wheat. What that means is that gluten has the ability to hold gas, and that's what gives a nice lift to bread. It holds the gas when fermentation occurs. So it's a very functional protein in wheat, and it helps wheat basically make bread. So in a nutshell, it's a very important protein in wheat, and it's the protein that makes wheat functional.
And it's the glue that binds everything.
For sure, yes.
Yeah.
The other thing that I would add, thanks to people like Monica who are doing research, they've sort of boiled it down to, a 33 amino acid fragment that is the big culprit in initiating celiac. It's that fragment. These proteins have many, many amino acids, but there's a certain fragment that when people are exposed to that, and you have, the right genetics, whatever else it is that causes celiac, that's what leads to the intestinal inflammation and damage that people get.
So are they doing research, or Dr. Malagoda, are you doing research on trying, is there any way we can get rid of those amino acids in wheat?
Well, theoretically, if you remove the gluten proteins from wheat, it wouldn't be functional anymore, because like I said, gluten is what gives wheat its functionality. But with regard to specific peptides, there's some research as to whether we could sort of deactivate or cleave these peptides. And I saw one recent paper where they cleaved these peptides and they used sourdough fermentation to reduce the allergenic nature of the end product. So there are several approaches being tested right now, and the challenge lies with deactivating enough gluten protein so that we could get that gluten up to a very low limit, so that they can be tolerated by people with celiac disease, and that's a very difficult thing to do, and it has to be done very safely. So that's work in progress, I would say.
Yeah, and just to add to that, so there are trials now where you can take a capsule with these enzymes, as Monica said, that split fragments, and it turns out that the enzymes that we have don't split this fragment very well, but there are other enzymes that do. And so if you eat your food and eat your gluten, plus you eat one of these capsules, the hope is that they would break them enough that they wouldn't cause any damage, and that would be a treatment that would be a medicine, not a diet. And I think it's a good story and a bad story. The good story is we've gotten to the point where we're doing a clinical trial. I don't think it will ever lead to the ability to just have your sandwich with regular bread, unfortunately, because that's a lot of gluten to try and hydrolyze, and it's very unlikely to be that powerful. You never know what science can do. There may be some role in when you are at a restaurant, or there may be contamination risks. And if this were to work, and there was a small amount of gluten, maybe it would do the trick. And so it's in a clinical trial stage where it's being investigated, where people are ingesting this, they're getting tested systematically. And so I suspect within a couple of years, we'll have some information just how useful that might be. And if it's useful, then it would certainly be something that would come to the market.
Thanks. That's great. Betsy, we have a question specifically for you.
Okay.
I enjoyed the products you made with Teff flour. Can you tell us why you had to make the change?
Oh, yes. Supply and demand has a lot to do with what flours are available to us or to me. Teff is it's kind of a relative to amaranth and quinoa. They are all high in protein. They do really amazing things. And so Teff is sort of the African version of quinoa. And when quinoa went super high in price, we switched to amaranth because it became less affordable. Because you probably know our bread is quite expensive because our ingredients are so expensive. And we have to import a lot of our ingredients because we don't grow it locally. And if we do grow like quinoa, which actually does grow on the prairies, the price that you would have to pay for it is quite astronomical. And then nobody wants to pay $20 for a loaf of bread. So then we always looked for a substitute. So from quinoa, we went to amaranth, and then from amaranth, we went to Teff, mostly because of what's available, what we can find fairly easily, and what can be substituted in the bread and give you the same kind of outcome. Because not every flour that we use behaves the same way. And so you need to find different flours that will do the job equally or as close to equal as possible. And so we do still have a Teff bread. We have Teff buns. And so it's a higher protein. And there is flax in our Teff bread. So you're getting some good fiber there as well. And so we are still using Teff, but it's one of those ingredients that we're still learning how to use because it's not something that, has been passed down from generation to generation like wheat. You didn't learn from your mom and you didn't learn from your grandma and, further and further. Whereas Teff is a brand new flour sort of for North America, I would say. And so we're still learning how to use it and how to use it more efficiently and more effectively to give us that great mouthfeel and, as close to real bread as possible.
Thanks.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I've never heard of Teff.
Oh yeah, it's fairly new to the North American market. I heard about it for the first time about 6 years ago. And I thought, you know what, that's going to be the next quinoa. We seem to go on these, little bumps and valleys of which flour is more popular right now and which one isn't. And so as long as people stay away from Teff, it won't become super popular and it'll stay in a decent price. But, because we're importing also, we have to look at brokerage fees, shipping fees, and we always have to have extra on hand. So that in case we run out. And during COVID, we actually did run out of one of our flours because CFIA decided that small importers like me needed to have a license to import gluten-free flour. And I didn't have the license yet. So we had to look for alternatives. And to be honest, it messed up all of our recipes because the grind was not the same. The outcome was not the same. It was an inferior product and we struggled to make bread look like bread and cake, taste and feel like cake because it was a different ingredient and it was ground differently. So just the tiniest little changes will affect the outcome.
You answered my question because I was going to ask how the pandemic had impacted supply chains. Because if you are importing, I mean that's
huge. Yes, because we do a fair amount of importing, and even with our pricing is going food prices are skyrocketing, and everybody knows that, but they're also happening to us as well. And a lot of it is because there isn't that workforce. They're either sick with COVID or nobody's at work, or, I don't know what's going on in different countries, but the supply or the demand is outweighing the supply. And so now we're seeing a lot of our ingredients increase in price because it's just, and the drought, honestly, in the prairies also will have an effect. It'll have an effect on the oats, the canola that we use for frying. It's all going up. And then also flax. How were the fields this year? We drove in the country and man, you could see right through a canola field, and that's not a good sign. So we know that prices are going to be affected because of the drought. And then with the heat that we had in BC, that affects our fruits and even some vegetables. And so, it's like you're always staying on top of commodities, and you're always staying on top of, where can I source, if this is this much, can I find a different supplier that's equally as good and still get a decent price, right? So that we don't have to change our pricing so dramatically.
And what about how did the pandemic impact the demand side? You talked about demand still being high because we know that the pandemic has impacted small businesses in the restaurant industry, but you're a niche market. So how did it affect the demand side?
Yeah, I think we fared decently because we are a niche market. Like Dawn had mentioned, people with celiac disease need to eat a gluten-free diet. And I will not cheat because it's not worth it. It's, I wouldn't, been there, done that, and it's no fun. And so, so we kind of polled our customers who have been huge fans of ours, thank goodness, for a couple of years already. And we said, what are you missing? What are you not able to get? Or, at the time when we went down to 10% capacity in grocery stores. Okay, so now you've got one person from your family that's allowed to shop. So there's no looking around. There's no finding new products. There's no, luxury of trying new things. It's like get in, get out. And so what we asked our customers was, how can we help you through the pandemic? And what we started was a delivery service. And so it was me driving, all around town, making deliveries, and people would pre-order, and then we would make and then get that out as fast as we could. But we're still not back to normal. We're not operating at 100% capacity. And that's by and large due to shortage of work staff. We just don't have enough people working. And then also, one of the lessons we learned because of COVID was that our restaurant is actually too small to be viable as a restaurant. And we didn't know that. I was never a restaurateur. I was never a baker. I came from marketing and communications. And so I kind of went, well, how hard can this be? It can't be that hard. Well, I found out how hard it was. And so for my own sanity and the sanity of my employees, we have decided to just do 1 8-hour shift and to be closed for 2 days versus only 1 day. And so, we are definitely seeing a deficit. But thanks to the federal government subsidies, we've managed to kind of limp through, hopefully, what is the worst of COVID. But you never know. And even today we hired a baker and we said, we can't promise that, you're going to have a job for a year, because we just don't know what COVID is like, what the next variant is going to be and how that will affect, different people. I will say the one thing that we heard very positive from our customers during COVID was they were happy that we were open, because we were sort of their source of the comfort foods, and that they were missing, and the bread. Bread is our number one seller, and so they were happy that they could still access, the food that they were used to, which was great. But the other thing, that we really experienced was, we put out the word and said, hey, we need your help if we're going to make it through this. And we learned that the celiac community really stepped in to help us. And where we were trying another revenue stream, which was the plant-based, we found that there was less support from the plant-based community than from the celiac community. So what that told me as an entrepreneur was I really need to focus on food that is beneficial for people with celiac disease. And then we see a lot of people with dairy sensitivities. And so that's what we were focused. That's what we're now is our major focus, is people with celiac disease and people who have dairy sensitivities, whether they also have celiac or it's just a dairy sensitivity. We see sort of the gamut, right? And so we try to help as many people as possible, but as Dr. Dirksen knows, there are people on so many different, on this spectrum. Like we were talking about FODMAPs earlier, we'll have people that will come in and say, I can't have, garlic, tomatoes, sort of some of those more nightshade and higher FODMAP vegetables. And, they said, what do you have that I can eat? And I was like, oh man, we have very limited, because we use fresh ingredients, and we put all of those ingredients, instead of using additives or preservatives. That's what brings the flavor. So that might be something, if we see a high enough demand, maybe we'll go down that road a little bit. But we learned that we really need to stay true to our celiac community.
Okay, you touched on some questions coming in. Do I also have to avoid lactose or dairy products? I assume this is somebody asking about if they have celiac disease. Do they also have to avoid lactose or dairy products? And maybe just talk about all the different reasons why somebody might avoid dairy.
Sure. I can maybe start, and if you want to add, that'd be fine. One of the things that, one of the main reasons people don't tolerate dairy is the lactose, or the sugar that's in there. Mm-hmm. And in order for us to digest this sugar, there's an enzyme that actually is in the intestinal lining itself called lactase. And if you have celiac disease initially, you have destruction of these villi, and this lactase becomes less numerous. And so you may be unable to tolerate milk and milk products while the celiac is active. When you go gluten-free, it takes variable time, but after perhaps 6 months, a year, you'll get complete recovery, so even longer than that. And if you get recovery and you weren't lactase deficient to begin with, then you should be able to digest milk and milk products again. So I do tend to recommend to people who have an intolerance and are celiac that once their celiac has recovered, based on their blood tests, etc., to try milk again. Now, the caveat is that people are born with lactase deficiency as a separate problem, and that can be quite common in certain ethnic groups. So some Oriental groups, it's as high as 40% of people will be lactose intolerant, and so that is independent of celiac. So they may have celiac, but they've also got lactose intolerance, two separate things. And so after they recover from their gluten-free diet, they may need to avoid lactose as well. but it wouldn't be directly celiac related. Now, there are people, and Betsy, you might see these, that also have a milk allergy. Allergy is different from a sensitivity or from a lactose problem. So that's where there's a protein within milk that causes a reaction. And, it's more common in kids. But if that's the case, then you definitely have to avoid dairy products because it's the protein in there that could potentially cause a reaction. So there are different types of reaction related to dairy. But my message for celiacs is that it would be very reasonable to avoid or to re-challenge yourself once you're feeling better to see if you can tolerate it. There are some formal tests for lactose intolerance, for lactase deficiency. We don't have those here in Manitoba. They're breath tests. So we do we challenge. We do challenges and withdrawals to see how people respond. The other thing, sort of one last thing I'll say about lactose, which may be of some interest. It's not always an all or none phenomenon. So some people have a bit of lactase activity, meaning there's a bit of that enzyme. So if they have a small amount, they're fine. If they exceed a certain threshold, then they start getting symptoms. So they might be able to have a bit of a hard cheese, for instance, which has a low lactose level, but soft cheeses might be tough, or ice cream may be tough. So it may not necessarily be an all or none sort of phenomenon.
Okay. Did anybody have anything else to add to that?
Well, I can give a bit of a personal experience. When I was finally diagnosed with celiac disease, I could tolerate dairy. And I thought, thank goodness, don't take away my whipped cream and my milk and, all of that. But over time, which is very interesting, in the last 5-6 years, I started to notice I could tolerate it sometimes, but not other times. And then now I just avoid it altogether. So, I mean, earlier we were talking about how do you substitute milk and, and dairy products. Well, for myself, I'll drink a lot of almond milk, or I'll eat almonds, or look for other ways to get my calcium, just so that, it's still coming in. And there are cheese is getting better. But the other interesting thing I have learned is that I can tolerate goat products. So I'm going to guess it's because the protein in the goat's milk is maybe more digestible than, say, a cow's milk. For whatever reason, I don't know why, but maybe science can help me out with that. But that's what I have found for myself. And actually, one of my girls too is now not able to to tolerate dairy products. But the other two can. So why? I don't know.
Okay, next question. We kind of, Dr. Dirksen and Dr. Malagoda, I think we kind of discussed this, but maybe you have something to add. What type of work is being done towards a cure or towards accommodating adding gluten back into our diets?
So, I'll let Monique tackle whether you can develop a gluten-free wheat, which still has the properties of wheat and doesn't have the antigens. And before I let her talk about that, I think that in terms of managing celiac, we talk about the enzyme that might allow you to eat wheat. The other thing that people are, I think one thing that's been very well worked out in the past 10 years is how this protein with these amino acids, how does it actually cause this damage? What's the whole process? And there's now a whole pathway that this leads to this, which leads to this, which leads to this, and the end result is that now we have inflammation and intestinal damage. There are some ways to intervene in different pathways. One was taking these enzymes to break things down. There's another medication out there that's being tested that makes the intestine less leaky and less likely for these proteins to cross and cause damage. So there are clinical trials going on as we speak on that one. There is also some factors that are released. There's one called interleukin-15, which is quite damaging, and there is an inhibitor of that. There's a blocker that you can take as a medication. There's also a trial going in that. And then probably the most exciting area, short of developing a grain, would be a vaccine. And people are interested in, could we induce tolerance? Is there some way of tricking the immune system to not recognizing gluten as being foreign and causing this inflammation? And by exposing it to very tiny amounts, and then you develop some tolerance, and then you can kind of, again, trick the immune system so that eventually it doesn't, you don't have that reaction. And there actually is, again, a vaccine. There was one that was tried, which unfortunately had an effect, but wasn't good enough, so it didn't work. And now there's a second one where it's only at the very infant stages of trying it in sort of healthy people, just to look at safety, never mind effectiveness. And then once it's considered safe, then the next thing would be, is it effective? So that would be super exciting, because it would be kind of a game changer. These other medications, might make living on a gluten-free diet easier, but probably won't replace it. And if we could have a grain that would solve this, then we're laughing. Minika.
Sure, thank you, Don. So I think there's promise in developing a grain that's low in gluten. I wouldn't say without gluten. For example, in Australia recently, they developed ultra low gluten barley using traditional breeding approaches. So what they did was that they selected varieties that are inherently or naturally low in these peptides, and they use those as parental varieties to breed ultra low gluten barley. And with that, you can still make beer, and that can be consumed by those with celiac disease, because the gluten level is lower than the 20 ppm threshold. So I think there's promise, but when it comes to wheat, again, the challenge lies in preserving the functionality while sort of deactivating the gluten proteins. There are several approaches that can be tested, and I know that there have been several studies in this area. One would be gene silencing. So if you could sort of inactivate the specific genes that are responsible for these proteins, that could be a way forward. And more sort of novel genetic methods like CRISPR could be, something that's something we could use to develop celiac safe wheat. And again, traditional breeding methods could be employed if we identify parental varieties that are naturally low in gluten and specific proteins that cause celiac disease. So like I said earlier, there's huge variability between cultivars in North America, in Europe, in terms of the amount of the proteins and the specific epitopes. So I think we could find parental cultivars that are comparatively much lower in gluten and the specific epitopes that cause celiac disease. And I would leave it up to the breeders to do all the breeding.
Natalie, one other thing that I might just add as a cautionary note. So currently there's nothing on the market that replaces a gluten-free diet. There are some enzymes out there that are marketed. There's one called gluten cutter. There's a whole bunch of them, and they do have some effect for sure in splitting gluten and making it potentially less toxic. But none of them will do it to the degree that you need in order to be able to still eat gluten. So I wouldn't recommend them if you're trying to adhere to a strict gluten-free diet and have celiac disease. I wouldn't recommend taking these in order to allow you to eat gluten. It's not going to be good enough.
Would you recommend it for anybody? Like, say somebody has irritable bowel who's sensitive.
Yeah. I would say for those who are sensitive, who might have an irritable bowel, where the amount of gluten may be important. So if I decrease that a bit, it may help. Then in that context, they may get some benefit.
Okay, thanks for adding that. After starting a gluten-free diet, how long would you expect a person to start noticing results, assuming they have celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity?
It always surprises me how quickly people feel better. And frequently people will feel better. Sorry, my kicks out for a little bit. So they can feel better very quickly, even though if you were to test them at 2 weeks, their biopsies will still show quite a bit of inflammation, and their antibody tests, which will also be quite high. So it is intriguing, but I think that some of the factors that the inflammation causes, some of the proteins and the inflammatory proteins, they decrease quite quickly, and that probably is responsible for people feeling better, even though the healing hasn't occurred. And that healing can take months to even a couple of years, but the feeling better can happen very quickly. And sort of the other thing associated with this, I mean, it gets back to reactions to eating gluten. It's amazing how quickly that happens. So someone has gluten, and when I ask them, they say, within an hour, they will get symptoms. If you think of the whole mechanism of how gluten has to cross into your intestine and activate intestinal cells and things, proteins have to be activated. There's a lot that has to go on, but for some reason, this triggering can happen very quickly, that you can get symptoms very quickly, and you can recover very quickly if you take away that stimulus, if you take away that gluten.
Right. If I can quickly jump in, there are also lots of hidden glutens. We talk about the obvious, like the bread and cereals and that kind of thing. But that's another reason to do a lot of label checking. We never imagined that Smarties would contain gluten, or that licorice would contain gluten. So things that you may not associate as glutinous, you do need to adhere to a strict gluten-free diet, is looking at all of the labels and seeing, soy sauce. Well, who would have guessed, that could contain, or Worcestershire sauce, or any of those things. So it's important to also read your labels, look at what is on the label or even may contain. Like, you can find all kinds of nuts on the go, and they'll say, it may contain wheat and blah, 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 blah. So depending on how sensitive you are, you might want to avoid that altogether.
Okay, the next question is, are there financial support or gluten-free food banks available for clients who are diagnosed with celiac disease? I think I can probably answer part of this, because I get the emails from the Canadian Celiac Association, the Manitoba chapter. So I know that they've been working with Manitoba Harvest, formerly Winnipeg Harvest, during the pandemic to get gluten-free foods in hampers, since they've switched to the hamper model. Does anybody else want to tackle financial support? That I know that there's the CRA also. You can talk about that.
Yeah, I was going to mention the CRA, that you can get, you can claim it on your income tax. What you can claim is the difference you spend on gluten-free food versus regular food. So it means keeping track of the gluten-free food that you eat. And, for instance, if a gluten-free bread is $6 and you normally buy bread for $3, you could claim $3, sort of thing. So it involves some work, but there is that tax, CRA tax subsidy that you can get.
Yes. And part of that, with our restaurant and bakery, we will have customers who specifically ask for an itemized receipt. And then that's what they are doing, is they are tracking, like if they're buying bread, if they're buying muffins, whatever. And it needs to say gluten-free on your receipt in order to submit it to CRA. And like Don said, it's only the difference. So it does involve a lot of work and a bit of a spreadsheet kind of thing. And that, for me, it's not worth it. to do all that extra work. But we have some customers who are, who have been doing it diligently, and for them it works.
Okay, now there's a series of questions about testing. So, Dawn, maybe we can handle them all together. The first one, I had a biopsy and the doctor decided that I have celiac. Is it okay to tell that I have celiac, or do I have to undergo other tests to confirm it?
Yeah, I would say if the biopsy has been definitive, then that's it. You have celiac. So these days, I would say that the combination of having a positive antibody and then having a biopsy that shows some villus damage, that is diagnostic of celiac disease. Now, and that's very straightforward in many cases, 90%. There's gray zones, like there's in anything else, where the blood tests are a bit abnormal and the biopsies are normal. What do we do in that case? The antibodies are normal and the biopsies are a bit abnormal. What do you do about that case? So there are nuances in diagnosis, but if you have an abnormal antibodies, high antibodies, and you have an abnormal biopsy, that would be considered celiac disease.
So how does being IgA deficient, low total IgA, affect getting diagnosed via blood test?
Great question. So when you look at the antibody that's measured, this TTG antibody, the subclass that is, there are different types of antibodies. This is an IgA-based antibody. So if I'm IgA deficient, I don't make IgA and I don't make IgA TTG. And so if we do the regular testing, it will be negative. For most people, when I test, and a lot of people do this, they will test the TTG antibody and the total IgA level to make sure that people aren't too deficient. If they are deficient in IgA, then we can do an IgG TTG antibody, and that's the substitute test. But that's not the usual one that we run as routine. If you ask for a celiac test, the lab's going to run an IgA because that's the more accurate test for most people. If you're IgA deficient, then it's the IgG test that is. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, you just cut out the last 10 seconds, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry. So I was just going to say that if you're IgA, normally the lab will run an IgA TTG, and if you ask for a celiac test, that's the test they're going to run. If you are IgA deficient, they will then run an IgG TTG antibody, and if that's positive and you're deficient in IgA, then that would suggest you have celiac, and then you need a biopsy.
So this question about testing is, should you be retested if you were diagnosed many years ago?
Yeah, so I would say that once you have the diagnosis, and again, provided that it was diagnosed with antibody testing and biopsy, then I don't see a need to retest to say you have celiac disease. If there was a question of the diagnosis, then yes. That's a different question than follow-up. I think people should be followed for their celiac at some point. And we do use the antibodies as markers because they tend to disappear, not in everybody, but they do tend to disappear, so we will measure those. Sometimes when we're not sure how the recovery has been, we will repeat a biopsy at some point in the future to confirm that things are looking good and that things have healed up properly. And that's sort of an individual decision. So again, once you have the diagnosis, you've got it. It's done. If it's a true diagnosis, and so I think there's no need to retest if that was confirmed.
Okay, this question I think you might have answered then. How often do people with controlled celiac need to have an endoscopy and a colonoscopy?
Yeah, right. Okay, so as far as the colonoscopy goes, with celiac disease, one of the main reasons we do colonoscopy tests is to look for polyps and colon cancer, and celiac's not a risk factor for that. So you'd be treated like anybody else. If you had a family history of colon cancer, that'd be relevant. But in terms of celiac, you wouldn't need a regular colonoscopy. If you have celiac disease and have diarrhea on top of it, despite being careful with gluten-free diet, that would be a reason to have a colonoscopy, because there's a type of colitis people can get called microscopic colitis that you want to look for. As far as the gastroscopy goes, there are now two camps that people are in. Traditionally, for the past couple of decades, what we've done is we've said, okay, you have celiac, go on a gluten-free diet, you start feeling better, your blood tests normalize, your iron deficiency gets better, and we check some antibodies, they're normal, and you're feeling great. We leave it alone. We assume you're doing well. And that's how we've done it. And that's how most people do it. In the past 5 years, people thought, well, people don't recover quite as much as we thought they did. And so maybe we should be doing a biopsy on a regular basis. That isn't routine practice at this stage of the game. It's not unreasonable to at some point do a biopsy to see if things have gotten better. And certainly if there's a concern about whether this is healed well or not, then it is a reasonable thing to do. But you could certainly make a case if everything is going well, symptoms are good, blood tests are good, and you're feeling well, that you wouldn't need that biopsy repeated.
Thanks. We're getting lots of questions, I think, coming for you, Don. We're going to give you a few minute break here, and we're going to ask, I think, that Betsy and Manica, what flours or starches, other than pulses or nuts, that are higher in nutrients? Others then were mentioned were teff, amaranth, and quinoa. So are there any other types of flours or starches you would recommend as alternative?
Rice would be one. That's what came to mind first.
Betsy, are those the most common flours? You're muted right now. That you would use? I mean, rice and the ones that were mentioned, I can't think of any other ones.
Yeah, we the pulses aren't always, you can't use them on their own as much because they tend to have a stronger flavor or aftertaste. But yeah, tapioca starch, potato starch, rice, when you use white rice, it's considered, it functions like a starch. We use, teff, quinoa, oats. We have tried the other two. I'm trying to think what else we have. We are using buckwheat, again, fairly new for us. And when I was looking into buckwheat and actually millet, buckwheat is grown in Canada. However, at this point, there is not a dedicated gluten-free source for buckwheat in Canada. So we are importing it from North Dakota, from a gluten-free mill in North Dakota. I have heard that there's plans for a buckwheat mill here in Canada, either Manitoba, Saskatchewan, but I don't know where that's at. We're also experimenting a little bit with canola protein and pea protein. And that's because they are new to Winnipeg as well, through, oh shoot, now I can't remember what it's called, but there's a new source in Winnipeg. And so we're looking at how do we bump up our protein in our everyday sort of flours that we use, and could pea protein be something that we could use. So we're always on the hunt for sort of newer ways of doing things. And if it's from Canada, all the better. But those are sort of the ones I would say that we, there's so many. You can go on all kinds of tangents, but it's whether the supply is big enough to support what we do. And so there's banana flour, there's all kinds of other flours that people are experimenting with, sweet potato flour.
Sorghum. I'm just getting this
Sorghum,
from
yes, sorghum as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, at some point you can only have, so many that you want to stock. And so I think no matter where you would go, each gluten-free bakery is going to have their sort of clump of flours that they are familiar with, that they use. And we have ours, and that's, yeah, there's lots to choose from. It's just whether they're readily available.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to try to get through as many of these. We have to wrap up soon. So Dawn, this is for you. I have a sensitivity related to an autoimmune disorder, Hashimoto's. I feel much better on a gluten-free diet and wonder if I will damage my intestines if I do eat gluten.
So again, I would assume that this individual doesn't have celiac disease. There is a relationship, by the way, between celiac disease and thyroid disease. So, Hashimoto's is an autoimmune disease. And so people that have celiac are much more likely to be hypothyroid and get Hashimoto's. In fact, over the lifetime, probably about 30% of people will get low thyroid. Now, but hypothyroidism is very common, and it's also possible to have that in isolation. So aside from having a slightly higher risk of having celiac disease, if you have autoimmune thyroid disease, gluten doesn't directly affect that unless you had celiac and didn't know it. So I would say that it would be okay to eat gluten as long as you don't have celiac. If you develop symptoms, then celiac would be something you'd have to look for.
Mm-hmm.
So unfortunately, we're running out of time. We have a lot of more questions than we have time to answer, so that's too bad. But that means we had a great audience, an engaged audience. So I'd like to thank all of you for joining me tonight. The time just flew by.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to thank also the audience, and I hope everybody found it, as informative and fun as I did. I encourage all the viewers to tune in again for the next U of M Café Scientifique on October 20th, when you will hear about work led by the University of Manitoba's Institute for Global Public Health in achieving the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. So another really exciting, relevant topic. All those details can be found on the University of Manitoba website, umanitoba.ca/Café Scientifique. And thank you all for listening, and I wish you all a wonderful evening.
Mm-hmm.
Bye.
Goodbye.